It's no secret that Chen is one of the most difficult heroes to play in Dota, but the difficulty is not just in micro, but also in things like skill builds and item builds, which can actually be very flexible on Chen. So in this video we're going to do a deep dive on that. We're going to look at skill builds, at item builds, at what pros do, at how you can adapt that to your pub games, and we're starting right now.
My holiness deepens.
Welcome to the Church of Obelis. There are 3 fixed points when it comes to skill builds on Chen. The first one is that you want to max out your persuasion first. So when you're level 7, you want to have 4 points into Holy Persuasion. The second one is that you scale Hand of God whenever you can. It's your ultimate, it's very strong, it scales quite well, so definitely take this whenever you can. And then a third one is that you want a single point in Divine Favor early on. Usually that's at level 1 or level 2, sometimes as late as level 4, but you always want at least 1 point in Divine Favor. It's an excellent value point, gives you 2 regen per second as an aura, gives you a slight heal increase, and of course, very importantly, allows you to teleport allies to yourself. Outside of that, everything else is up for grabs. Both Penitence and Divine Favor are quite strong when you level them up, and which one you take depends a lot on what kind of position you play. It depends on the game state, it depends on how much use you can actually make of this recall ability, which depends a lot on how well you know the people you're playing with. If you're playing in a pub game, a solo queue game, where you don't know the other players, you can't make as good use of this as if you play with people you know. And also generally in high level games, people are better playing around Divine Favor, so the higher MMR you are, the more useful Divine Favor becomes. And then Penitence, if you're playing Chen in more of a core role, then Penitence tends to become stronger. Also, it's very important how much mana you have and how much mana your items give you and how much mana your items consume. Especially if you're looking at an item like Mech, which is very mana hungry, then maybe you don't want points into Penitence because that's another spell you have to spend mana on. Whereas Divine Favor, I mean, sure, the active costs mana, but generally this doesn't consume nearly as much mana as using Penitence does. So let's look at a couple of pro players and see how they skill Chen. Let's look at 2 games that are pretty much polar opposite in terms of skill builds. This first one is from Puppy playing Chen, position 4. And he of course maxes out his Persuasion. Then second, he maxes out Divine Favor with no points at all in Penitence. Only starts taking Penitence right at the end, and of course ultimate whenever you can, and here in this game he goes for the level 10 talent right at level 10. So this kind of build conserves on mana, but even so he still has to get some clarities, because Chen is actually quite a mana hungry hero. In this patch in 723 a lot of his mana costs were increased, so this makes this build quite strong. Even though you're missing out on all of your Penitence, you have no sort of disable except what you get from your creeps and possibly from neutral items. So this is definitely a drawback of this build, but it just conserves a lot of mana and allows you to get this Divine Favor online very quickly and allows you to have this very healing intensive build that allows you to rush mech without having too much mana issues. And the second build we're going to look at is here from a game of 33 playing position 3 Chen, and he does basically the opposite of what Puppy does. He of course still goes for Persuasion at level 7, but then he only takes a single point in the aura at the start and maxes out this second. He even goes for a level of Penitence here at level 2, which is quite unusual. Even when playing offline Chen, you probably still want to get this aura at level 2, but sometimes, depending on station and lane, you just don't need as much regen, and then it can be fine to just get a point in Penitence here and be able to play more aggressively in lane. So this earlier Penitence max works quite well as position 3 Chen, because you have this Dominator, you have just earlier timings on your levels, so this just becomes really strong when you have this at next out at level 10, and you're running around with those 5 strong creeps, and as position 3 Chen, your lane often goes quite well, and you have this fairly early, and that just makes those creeps even more of a threat in the early mid game. Of course, this build is very mana hungry, so you definitely have to buy clarities, you have to buy mangoes. And you note that 33 skipped mech here in this build, which means that he just needs a lot less mana, which means he can more easily afford to go for this more mana hungry build, and doesn't have to buy something like early arcane boots to cover all his mana needs. You also note that he went for the level 10 talent and level 14, and both these options you get at level 10, either the cast range or the health, are rather mediocre, so it often makes sense just to go for these other skills over this talent. And what you can even do is you can even get this talent at level 16. You can, if you do this build, you can put another point in Divine Favor at level 14, then level 15 you can actually just get the 15 talent and then get the 10 talent at level 16. Looking at the interface, it looks like you can actually take these level 15 talents. They're grayed out, only these are active, and if you use hotkeys you can only take these two. By the way, you should always skill those abilities with hotkeys. If you're clicking here, that's usually very bad. You should be using hotkeys for everything you can, but in this particular case you can't use hotkeys, you have to click. So you can click on either of these and you can take these talents. And then you have this level 15 talent, but not a level 10 talent yet. And then we level up again. You can go ahead and take those, take that level 10 talents. Speaking of talents, which talents should you choose? Well, it's very situational. Level 10, generally the better one is the health talent, but the cast range talents can also be very valuable, especially if you go for some items that benefit from that. Like if you go for a medallion or a solar crest, that can be useful. If you go for something like a spirit vessel, the cast range has some extra value. If you go for something like a rod of Atos, but generally you don't go for many of these items, so most of the time the only thing that really benefits from this cast range is Penitence, and Penitence is a good spell and all, but as you say, taking this talent just for Penitence is generally not worth it, so most of the time you go for the health. At level 15 it depends a lot on what kind of setting you're playing in. If you're playing in a team that's organized, where players know how to play around Chen, the Divine Favor cooldown talent is generally a bit better. So this takes the cooldown from 80 seconds to 40 seconds, which is very strong obviously. But if you're playing in a more disorganized team, if you're playing solo queue outside of the very highest MMR ranges, players generally don't really know how to play around Divine Favor, and it's quite difficult to actually use Divine Favor profitably, so you're not using this all that often, and in those cases it's usually just better to go for the Holy Persuasion damage. The damage talent isn't that useful in team fights, because at that stage of the game you can't really send your creeps in team fights usually, because you just die instantly. But it's useful outside of team fights. It's useful in ganking, it's useful in pushing out waves, it's useful in taking objectives after the enemy team is dead, or if it's elsewhere. It's useful for doing Roshan quickly. This is quite a strong talent. Both of these are very strong, and depends a lot on how much use you make of this recall. Level 20, you again have the choice between two very strong talents, plus 1000 minimum health for your persuasion creeps, or 180 gold per minute. So here it depends mostly on how much use you can get out of those creeps if you take the left talent. If your creeps are still quite strong, especially if you get an early level 20, this is generally the better talent. This is also why this talent is usually chosen on position 3 Chen, because you just get earlier levels, and then you can just do a lot with those creeps. but if you're playing support Chen, usually you get to level 20 very late in the game, and then your creeps are not really strong enough to do very much, even with this extra 1000 HP, so you often end up taking the 180 gold talent instead. Usually, if you support, you go for the gold talent, and you go for the minimum health talent if you're a core, but that's just a rule of thumb. Level 25, you have the 350 Hand of God heal and the +5 max persuasion units. Hand of God heal is typically the preferred talent. It's just always good, whereas the Holy Persuasion max talent is only useful if you actually manage to keep around more than those 4 creeps. Because anytime you only have those 4 creeps, this right talent doesn't do anything. It's purely wasted talent. So the left talent is the safer choice, but especially if you went for the plus health talent level 20, the +5 persuasion max unit can be quite strong, but most of the time it's the left talent, even if you went for the Holy Persuasion minimum health talent. A big factor here is that you can no longer stack cloak auras. In the previous patch, where you could stack cloak auras, the primary use of this +5 units was to get additional cloak units, but now it's difficult to get more than 4 really useful late game creeps. So in this patch it's mostly the Hand of God heal talent, but there are some games where the Persuasion max units comes into play. Let's talk about items. First, the core item. These are the items that you almost always want to buy. Stick or Magic Wand is just a very strong item on any kind of hero who can spare the slot, and on Chen it's actually even better because you have this Divine Favor which boosts the healing by 18%. Also, Chen, as you talked about, is a very mana hungry hero, so this extra mana is always very useful. Next we have Mech. Mech is just a very strong item in this patch. It's very cheap, less than 2000 gold. You can start with Headdress as a starting item. This is the standard starting item build for Chen, and this just means that your mech now is only 1500 gold away. This means that even if you position 5, you can typically get a mech between 10 and 15 minutes, and such an early mech is just very, very strong, allows your team to do a lot of good team fighting, and of course you get the extra bonus from Divine Favor, so that makes your mech even slightly better. That said, you don't absolutely have to buy mech just because you get this bonus, because you get this bonus also if someone in your team has mech. So if someone in your team really wants to buy mech, that's fine too, you can let them. But this is just an item that just fits Chen really well, so typically you end up buying this item if you're playing Chen. If you're playing position 3, sometimes you can just skip this, because a problem of this item is that it doesn't really help you farm. It's not an item that allows you to scale. So if you're playing position 3, you can still buy this, but you're generally not rushing mech. And then of course there's Boots of Speed. I have these in the 3rd position here, because you generally don't want to buy boosts very early on Chen. Movement speed is not that important for this hero. Against certain other heroes who can chase you, like an Ursa or something, you probably have to buy early boots. But in most games you can get away with getting boots quite late. So you can often just finish your wand and your mech and then buy boots afterwards. And then of course logical upgrade is Guardian Greaves after you have this mech. When you get Guardian Greaves is quite situational, but you almost always want to get it eventually, so that's why I'm including it here as a core item. So if you're playing against some sort of silence or something else that's very important to dispel, you probably want to rush this Greaves. Otherwise you often just buy 1 or 2 more items and then go back for the Guardian Greaves. Even if you don't go for the Guardian Greaves immediately, upgrading this Boost of Speed to a Arcane boost can be quite strong, because if you rush this mech, you're quite mana hungry, quite mana starved, so having this Arcane boost is quite a useful upgrade. And then our final core item is a situational core item, It's core if you're playing position 3 Chen. In that case, Helm of the Dominator is the item you want to rush. This is an item that allows you to scale. It's an item that's very strong if you get it early. And as position 3, you can typically get this at around like 7, 8, maybe 10 minutes if you're having a bad game. And such an early Dominator is very, very potent and just allows you to steamroll the enemies in a lot of cases. And with the aura combined with the extra creep, it also allows you to farm faster than you otherwise would. So this is an item that helps you with farming as well as with fighting, and that makes it a very potent item on position 3 Chen. You can also go for this item if you're support Chen and you're having a very good early game, especially with position 4. Basically, rule of thumb is if you can get this before 10 minutes, it's strong. Otherwise, just go for the mech. And that's one of the perks of starting with this headdress build at the start. You just get the headdress at the start, and then if you're having a really good laning phase as support Chen, you can go for Dominator. Otherwise, you can go for the mech. And Dominator is one of those items that is typically only good on Chen if you can get it very early. So I've seen some players, even pro players, get a later Dominator. They get something like a mech and then maybe another item, and then eventually they go for Dominator. I don't think this makes a lot of sense. Unless you're like playing with a hero that really, really benefits from this damage aura. Like if you have something like a Morphling in your team who just has so much base damage, so much attack speed. For him, this 20% damage aura is just really valuable. So maybe in a game like that, you might go for a later Dominator. But generally, the rule of thumb is you go Dominator either first item or not at all. Now let's look at the second tier of items. These are the strong items that you always want to consider, but they're not the kind of items you want to get every game. The first in this lineup is Pipe of Insight. Pipe is a very strong item. It's been repeatedly buffed over the last couple of years. It's so cheap now. It's 2,900 gold. It's amazing at what it does for its price, and you almost always want to have a pipe on your team. Obviously, there are some games where you're playing as a lineup that has almost no magic damage, but that's very rare. Most teams have at least a reasonable number of magic damage and enough to justify getting a pipe. So often you'll have an offlaner who wants to buy this item and who can get this item early, and then it's generally better to just let them buy a pipe. And you could buy 2 pipes. They stack mostly. The aura doesn't stack, but the damage block gets renewed if you cast it twice. So as long as you don't cast it at the same time, having a second pipe might still be valuable. But mostly you just want 1 pipe. And if you have an offlaner who wants to buy this item early, just let them do it. Otherwise, if they're not buying it, you can buy it if you're a support Chen. And if you're offlane Chen, generally it's your job to buy this item if your team needs it. So this is an item that is very strong, just allows you to win team fights, and it's just awesome all around. Then we have another aura item. You have Vlads. Vlads no longer gives the damage aura, which is kind of a pity on Chen, but does give more lifesteal now, and the armor aura has also been slightly nerfed. It's also more expensive, which is also a problem for Chen. So this item is a little bit weaker on Chen than it used to be, but if your teammates really benefit from lifesteal, it's an awesome item to get for them. It's not an item you want to rush, but like once you have, let's say, your mech, your mana boots, and you don't really need greaves, then you can like consider going for Vlad's as the next item. This is just an item that's always useful for your team. It scales quite well in the late game, and it's just an item that you always strongly consider going for on Chen.
Leap of faith.
Next is Glimmer Cape. This is just a very strong defensive item. If you have problems surviving, this is usually the go-to item. Generally, the rule of thumb on Chen is you want to buy as many aura and utility items as you can, and buy as many survival items as you must. So you find yourself dying a lot, go for those defensive items like Glimmer Cape. Otherwise, go for the more valuable aura items. Medallion used to be the go-to item on Chen, but it's received a couple of nerfs, same for Solar Crest. So these items are still strong, but they're no longer as strong as they used to be, which is why they're here in this tier. But definitely, this is an item you can strongly consider. You generally don't want to rush this. You probably, if you're playing support Chen, you want to go for a mech, and then you can definitely go for a medallion afterwards. Solar Crest is a strong late game kind of item, luxury kind of item, that you can especially consider if you have a hero who benefits a lot from this attack speed, but also is in the front lines and benefits from the armor. So if you're playing with a hero like Luna, for example, she's a hero that has to be in the front lines, deal with the enemy, she receives a lot of hits, but she also benefits a lot from the armor. So if you have a hero like that in your team, a hero like Terrorblade, for example, then Solar Crest is quite strong. Moving on to the more situational items, these are items that are strong in particular games, but they're not items you buy very often on Chen.
As you say.
So first of all, let's look at the survival items in this category. So we have Force Staff, which is of course an excellent item to kite enemies if you're playing against heroes like Ursa or Wraith King, who are vulnerable to being kited. This is an excellent item. If you're playing against a hero like Slag, for example, you can use this to get out of pounds. If you're playing against these kinds of heroes, Force Staff is great. Otherwise, generally not the best item on Chen. It's usually a better item on other kinds of supports. In Ghost Scepter, of course, if you have heroes that do a lot of physical damage, but the enemy doesn't have a lot of magic damage, playing against something like a Clinks, for example, Ghost Scepter can be very strong. And then of course Aeon Disc helps you not get bursted, so if they have a lot of burst in the enemy team, Aeon Disc is a strong item. Usually it's more of a luxury kind of item that you don't want to buy very early because you'd rather have other sort of more active ways of keeping yourself alive, and it's quite an expensive item which only helps you to stay alive. Here are even more situational items. We have Drum, which is quite strong on Chen. The aura is quite useful, the attack speed is nice, and of course stacks quite well with your Holy Persuasion, the damage you get from when it creeps from Holy Persuasion. And of course the active is awesome. Just generally the stats are not that useful on Chen, and the self-movement speed is also not particularly useful. So you usually prefer someone else in your team to get this, but it's quite useful to have this on your team. And if you're playing Position 3 Chen and no one else in your team is likely to buy a Drum, this is definitely a strong item you can consider. Often you can do something like a Dominator as first item and then a Drum as second item. Drum of course also helps you farming just with the passive aura, so it's a quite strong item on a more core style of Chen. But if you're playing support Chen and no one else in the team is buying this, this is also an item you can just buy in the mid or late game to give your team a boost. Crimson Guard is another excellent aura kind of item. It's not actually an aura, it's just an active, but it's kind of like an aura item. Of course, this guard is very strong against particular kinds of heroes, against something like a Visage. It just means you can completely ignore the damage from the birds. It's strong against other heroes like Lycan, for example. So if you're playing against these kinds of heroes, Crimson Guard is very, very strong. But generally, Crimson Guard is best on heroes who also go for a Vanguard. So if you have a hero in your team, typically an offlaner who goes for an early Vanguard, Crimson Guard, of course, is the logical extension. But if you don't have this in your team and you do need a Crimson Guard, why not buy it on Chen? Then we have Urn of Shadows, which is one of the most efficient items in the game. Gives you a lot of mana regen, a little bit of attributes and armor, and of course there's active that allows you to heal allies or damage enemies. This is a very efficient item. You usually should have an Urn of Shadows somewhere on your team, and if no one else wants to buy it, you can buy it on Chen. Chen isn't necessarily the best Urn of Shadow carriers, but he can buy the item. It helps him with his mana problems, so you can either go for Urn before your mech, or you can get an after your mech. If you bought a mech and you see no one on your team has an urn yet, you can just go for this. It will help you out with the mana problems, not quite as much as mana boots, but it'll help some. And it's just a really cheap and efficient item. And then of course, if you have this urn, you can upgrade it to a spirit vessel, which of course is strong against particular kinds of heroes, against hero like an alchemist or a husker. This is obviously awesome, but it just generally does a lot of damage, even against ordinary heroes, especially if you're talking about more tanky kind of heroes. This percentage-based damage is a lot. So if you bought an early urn, Spirit Vessel is an excellent upgrade for the mid or late game as more of a luxury kind of item. However, if you're playing against these heroes where you really need to rush a vessel, like an alchemist for example, in an enemy team, it's generally best to leave this to a core, like a position 2 or more likely 3 to buy a vessel, because in those kinds of games you just need this vessel right away, and waiting for like a position 5 Chen to farm a vessel is just too slow, so you want to have this on more of a core hero. Of course, if you play in Chen as a position 3, this is a really strong item to get in particular games, so you can just go for Dominator probably still first, and then get Spirit Vessel as your second item and counter those heroes like Alchemist or Husker. 8 Toss is a very situational item. It's the kind of item you go for if your team just really lacks disable. It's only a root, it's not a stun, but at least it cancels TPs. And if your team is really lacking on disable, 8 Toss is a very cheap option to get at least some disable on your team. But generally speaking, it's not really Chen's job to provide disables. Usually you should, like, your team should pick around Chen and pick other heroes who can offer this disable. But if your team doesn't have disables, this can serve as a band-aid. And then we have the worst item in the game, Holy Locket. Chen is one of the few heroes in which this item is okayish. It's still not great, but at least offers you something. You have a lot of heal with your Hand of God, as well as the mech that you typically go for. So this is an item that you can get like after you have your Greaves typically. Why not go for a Locket if there's no other item that you really need? But it's just not a very high priority item in most games. And then our last category is luxury items. These are the kind of items that you go for in a late game if you have way too much gold. So Hex is one of the obvious choices here. Scythe is just an awesome item in the late game on basically any hero, and why not go for this on Chen? It's of course especially strong if you went for the cast range talent level 10, and also if you go for a Scythe, it might also be worthwhile to invest in a Blink Dagger, which obviously Blink and Hex is a very strong combination. Aghanims used to be a very strong item on Chen, but now that you can no longer reliably recall creeps, you can still use Divine Favor to recall creeps, but if they take any sort of damage in 6 seconds, the recall will be cancelled, which previously you could just recall them within 3 seconds, no matter whether they took damage, and that just allowed you to easily split push waves with black dragons and then just recall them, and it's very difficult to kill a 2000 HP dragon within 3 seconds, so this was a very strong tactic that allows you to do a lot of farming with Chen once you get this Aghanims, but it doesn't work nearly as well in the current patch. Also, there's only one ancient camp per side these days, so Aghanims just generally not worth it. But if in the late game you have a lot of gold, maybe you go for an Aghanims. Lotus Orb is a great utility item. It's just not an item you typically want to buy on Chen because like the armor and all its HP regen and so on is not that useful in him. That's Lotus Orb is generally more of like an offlaner kind of item. These heroes that tend to be more tanky and so on. But if you want a Lotus Orb on your team, you can go for it on Chen. Of course, you typically have your Guiding Creeps to dispel yourself, but you can use this to dispel your allies, also protect them from incoming spells, or at least sort of semi-protect them by reflecting those spells. So this is an item you can go for if you have too much gold, basically. And the same category is Assault Cuirass. Offers your team a nice little aura, but generally more of a right-click hero kind of item, because the attack speed and the armor on Chen himself are not that useful. But of course the aura can be nice for your creeps, for your teammates. If you have way too much gold, AC is one of the ways you can spend this gold. So what does a typical game look like on Chen in terms of item builds? Starting item wise, you're almost always going to buy a headdress, you're going to buy a branch, and you're going to buy a set of tangos. This spends all your starting gold, this is very efficient, gives you a huge amount of regen in lane, and it's just all around awesome because you can use this headdress then to build your mech or your dominator, or in the rare cases where you don't go for either of those items, you can still pivot into a pipe. Your first item you typically buy in lane is a stick, possibly upgrading to a wand, and then it sort of diverges based on whether you're a support or a core. If you're position 5, you then go for mech. If you're a position 3, you go for dominator. And if you're position 4, it kind of depends on how the game is going. Whether you want to go for the more supporty round with mechanism or the more core-ish route with Helm of Dominator. Let's look first at support Chen. You go for mech. After that, typically you go for arcane boots. Then you add in like one item, typically maybe something like a Vlad's. This is very situational. Could also just go straight for Guardian Greaves, but let's say go for Vlad's, and then you finish up your Guardian Greaves, and then the game is probably already over. But from here, if your team doesn't have a pipe yet, you go for a pipe. If oftentimes you want to go for something like a Glimmer Cape, from here on out it's very situational. Now let's look at a typical core route. So first of all, you go for Dominator. After that, if you're position 4, that's the greedy position 4, you generally then go for the mech. If you're a position 3, just place pure position 3, you often throw in another item after this before you go for your mech. So you might throw in something like a drum, for example. There's a lot of options here, but drum is one of these. And then you probably go for your mech into Greaves, or maybe you go for an earlier pipe instead of this drums, or you might go for the drums and then for the pipe. There's a lot of options here, but this is just like one the typical option. And you might still at this stage go for the drums. You might go for something like a Solar Crest. You might even go straight for something like a Hex. It just depends a lot on what kind of game you're in. So, this is how you build Chen in 2020. Or, if you're super crazy, you can do this. This is super playing Chen and maxing Penitence first. I don't even know what to say about this. I have no idea if this build is good, but what I do know is I definitely want to watch this game, so I'm going to make a video about this game, which will be out in the next couple of days. So if you don't want to miss this craziness, please join the fold and subscribe to this channel, ring the bell. And in the meantime, here are some videos of some more sane Chen players doing normal things that make sense. And obelisk willing, I'll see you there.